The chandelier trembled, not from an earthquake or faulty wiring, but from the silence that swept through the ballroom when she stepped in. She wasn't invited. She didn't wear sequins or silk, just a long faded navy dress with the zipper barely holding its breath. Her shoes didn't click on the marble. They scuffed softly, like they didn't belong there. And maybe she didn't? Not yet. But in her hands was a worn envelope, thick, sealed, with the family crest engraved in gold, something only the inner circle would ever touch. The orchestra paused, uncertain. Champagne flutes hovered mid-air. The birthday cake for Walter Harrington Fora, man whose wealth could buy silence in courts and erase names from ledgers, waited uncut on the corner table. Dozens of blue-blooded guests turned to stare at her, first with confusion, then with insult, then discomfort, and then she said it. Slowly, softly, but it carried like thunder. "I'm not here for the cake. I'm here for the truth." No one moved. Her name was Elise Monroe. She worked at a nursing home by the docks, earning just enough to pay rent and buy pills for the woman who raised her Mama June. She was used to people not noticing her. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She knew how to disappear in crowds, how to lower her eyes when cashiers talked over her, but not tonight. Because 3 weeks ago, Mama June whispered something strange on her hospital bed. Something that stuck to Elise like cold sweat. "You came to me in a storm," she said, gripping Elise's hand with a kind of fear. "Wrapped in a white blanket and a gold locket. The woman who left you, she was crying. Said your father couldn't know. Said they'd erase you." Elise wanted to laugh at first, chalk it up to pain meds and fading memory. But Mama June had never lied to her. Not once. And something about her trembling voice, that urgent plea, "Find her. Find you," lit a match inside Elise that she couldn't put out. The locket had been hidden for years in the back of June's sewing box. Inside it, a photo. Blurry, aged, but unmistakably of a man in a military uniform. And beside him, a smiling woman in pearls holding a newborn with thick dark curls. On the back of the photo, "To my daughter, Elise. Forgive me. Nothing else." Elise barely slept that night. She held the photo like a key with no lock, searching online through faded news archives, military records, hospital registries. For weeks, she found nothing until a story popped up from 1989. Walter Harrington IV welcomes first son. Long-time affair with late socialite buried under scandal. She clicked. The woman in the photo appeared. Her name, Celeste Moreau. A brilliant linguist, vanished in the early 90s after rumors of an out-of-wedlock child shook the Harrington estate. No birth certificate, no burial records, just silence. Elise stared at the screen, heart racing. What if she paid a freelance investigator with her savings, everything she had left? Weeks later, the envelope arrived. Thick, full of proof. Letters exchanged in secret between Celeste and Walter. A positive DNA match from a hairbrush found in an old storage unit. And a sealed will signed by Walter himself, naming Elise M. as beneficiary dated just weeks before Celeste's disappearance. That envelope burned in her hands as she stood in the Harrington ballroom. Her fingers trembled, but not from fear. From the weight of being seen for the first time. Of not fading. Walter stood near the podium, flanked by his wife and their 3 well-groomed children. The eldest son, Carter, wore the same smug look Elise had seen in magazine's Corporate Predator, face of the family fortune. He was frowning now, hard. "I don't know who you are," Walter said finally, voice low and controlled. But Elise took a breath and opened the envelope. "This is your handwriting," she said, lifting a letter. "You wrote this to my mother when you found out she was pregnant. You promised to protect us. You offered her a home, away from the press. But she refused. She was scared. You were too powerful. Murmurs spread across the room like spilled wine. She unfolded the second sheet. This is your will, not the public one. The one you signed before everything went quiet. Dated June 3rd, 1991. You left me the house in Vermont. Your shares in Harrington and Knox. You called me your light in the storm. Walter's eyes flickered. Just once. And this, she said, holding up the photo, is the only picture of my mother I've ever seen. She died giving birth to me. Alone. A woman near the front gasped. Someone dropped a glass. Carter stepped forward, angry. This is insane. This is fake. You think anyone here is going to believe. But Elise didn't flinch. She simply handed the sealed DNA report to the man standing near the Cake Walters' longtime lawyer, Charles. Check it yourself, she said. You ordered this test on Walter's behalf in 2007. You knew. Charles went pale. He nodded slowly. I kept the documents as instructed until now. Walter staggered slightly. Age or guilt? I came tonight not to destroy your legacy, Elise said, voice trembling now with something deeper. I came because I want mine. She turned to the crowd. You all think legacy is about bloodlines and headlines. But legacy is truth, and mine was buried for 34 years. Silence. Some turned away. Others leaned in. A woman in a red dress, an aunt maybe, or a cousin, whispered, She looks like Celeste. Elise met Walter's gaze for the first time. I don't want your fortune, she said. I want acknowledgement. I want my name back. Then she added, almost gently, and I want peace. Walter stared at her for a long time. Then he closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, nodded. Walter Harrington IV did not speak again that evening. He simply turned his back to the microphone, shoulders lower than they'd ever seen them. For a man who'd commanded boardrooms and silenced senators, his silence said more than any speech ever could. Elise stood still as cameras clicked quiet, disbelieving guests capturing the moment like it was a glitch in reality. The black woman in the plain dress, the bastard, the forgotten, the rightful heir. A security guard approached her timidly, not to remove her, but to ask, Ma'am, do you need a glass of water? It was the most humanity she'd been offered in days. She nodded once. As the room began to break apart into murmurs and exits, Elise found herself standing in a shadowed corner, the locket still warm against her chest, her fingers unconsciously tightening around the letter from Walter. It had been written in blue ink, the kind that smudges easily, as if the words themselves had trembled. Celeste, if I could go back, I would have chosen you in the light. That one sentence haunted her more than any bank transfer or trust fund ever could. A woman in her 60s approached quietly. Hair silver, pearls real, her eyes softer than most around her. She looked at Elise not with suspicion, but with a strange sadness. I knew your mother, she said gently. We studied together in Geneva. She was brilliant, too brilliant for this world. Elise's throat tightened. Did you know about? I suspected. But no one was allowed to ask questions in this family, especially not about women like Celeste. She took Elise's hand and added, You speak like her. Soft but steady. They'll hate that. Elise gave a faint smile. Let them. That night, she didn't return to her cramped apartment by the docks. She stayed in a guest suite of the Harrington estate offered not by Walter, but by the housekeeper, who whispered, This house owes you more than space. Elise sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed, staring at the heavy curtains, the carved wood furniture, the portrait of Walter hanging above the fireplace. She didn't feel rich. She felt scraped open. The following morning, a letter was slipped under her door, embossed, official. It was from the family attorney, Charles. Elise Monroe, You are hereby recognized as a legal beneficiary of the late Celeste Moreau's estate, and a secondary heir named in the private will of Walter Harrington IV. Attached, property titles, a foundation in Celeste's name, still untouched, and a handwritten note from Charles. He was going to tell you. Before the cancer, he never got the courage. Elise folded the papers neatly and stared out the window. Courage. It was always the thing that men like Walter lacked, and women like Celeste paid for. Later that day, Elise walked the Harrington Gardens alone. Reporters had already started to circle the gates, their lenses waiting for a headline to grow out of her skin. But she wasn't interested in the cameras. She was searching for the old greenhouse, the one Celeste had written about in her last letter to Walter. I loved the way the sun poured through the cracked glass. It was the only place in that house I felt real. It took her an hour to find it, overgrown and forgotten, vines tangled across broken windows. The air smelled like dust and rain. Elise stepped inside and closed her eyes. She could almost feel her mother's hands brushing leaves aside, hear the sound of laughter that had never reached her ears. In that silence, she cried, not out of pain, but out of finally knowing. The confrontation came 2 days later. In the grand dining hall, as lawyers and advisors pored over old documents and attempted damage control, Carter Walter's oldest son stood up and pointed at Elise like she was a fraud he could erase with volume. You think this changes anything? You think a few letters and a DNA test make you one of us? Elise didn't answer. She didn't need to. The room waited, breath held. Carter laughed bitterly. You think people will accept you because some paper says you're a Harrington? Please. They'll smile for the cameras and spit behind your back. Elise calmly rose from her chair. That's what you're afraid of, isn't it? What? That they'll accept me anyway. That despite everything, they'll see I belong here because I endured without privilege, without status, and still I arrived. He clenched his jaw. You're not entitled to the legacy. She stepped forward, holding up a photo of Celeste. Again, her mother's eyes staring right through Carter. I and the legacy. Gasps echoed. Someone clapped quietly. Elise continued, voice low but steady. Your father left you wealth. He left me silence. I lived with the questions he was too afraid to answer. That silence carved me into something sharper than your entitlement. Carter's expression cracked, rage barely masked. We'll challenge everything. Charles the lawyer cleared his throat. You'll lose. Because the truth was not fragile anymore. It was documented, verified, witnessed. Elise didn't need revenge. She had facts. She had her name. And the law once bent to protect power was now bending toward dignity. That evening, Walter called for her. He was resting in the sunroom, a blanket over his legs, oxygen hissing softly beside him. He looked older, now smaller. Elise stood beside him without bitterness. I never hated you, she said first. He looked up, startled. I didn't know you, she continued, but I hated the absence. I hated growing up thinking I was no one because you chose silence. Walter's eyes filled, but he didn't cry. Men like him weren't taught how. You look like her, he whispered. So I've heard. I wrote you letters for years, he said. Never sent them. Cowardice is expensive. Elise nodded slowly. I paid the price. He turned away. Will you stay? I mean, stay in this world? In this family? She thought about it. The parties, the whispers, the legacy of arrogance. No, she said. But I'll leave a mark. He met her eyes. Good. Before leaving, Elise visited the family vault with Charles. Inside were portraits of Harrington ancestors, oil on canvas, each staring down as if the world belonged to them. And in the corner gathering dust was a sealed crate labeled Celeste Moreau. Elise opened it with reverence. Inside, journals, photographs, a violin case, and a single baby shoe. She held it in her palm, trembling. There was her inheritance. Not just wealth or land, but the weight of a woman who had chosen love over legacy, who had vanished so Elise could live. She didn't need to own the Harrington name to feel its gravity anymore. She had rewritten what it meant. Elise didn't pack much when she left the Harrington estate. A suitcase with her clothes, the crate of Celeste's belongings, and the folder of legal papers that now bore her name. But more than that, she carried something heavier, a name that no longer whispered in shadows, but stood in the sun. A truth no longer buried beneath shame and denial. As the driver pulled away from the iron gates, she didn't look back. The media followed her for days. Headlines flared like matches. Hidden heiress emerges. The secret Harrington bloodline. Celeste's ghost returns. But Elise refused interviews. She let the world chatter and spin. She had work to do. The estate in Vermont, mentioned in Walter's private will, was nearly forgotten. An old brick manor surrounded by woods and silence. It hadn't been visited in years. No servants, no surveillance, just stillness. When she arrived, keys trembling in her hand, the house greeted her like a memory she'd never had. She opened each door slowly. Dust shimmered in the sunbeams, like breath held in old lungs. There was a study with books her mother had once underlined, her handwriting faint in the margins. A bedroom with faded wallpaper of moons and constellations, half peeled as if waiting for a child that never came. And in the attic, covered in sheets, an old easel with a half-finished portrait. Celeste, staring out in blue tones, with eyes that mirrored Elise's exactly. Elise stood for a long time, touching the paint strokes. "My mother was not a secret," she whispered. "She was a promise." That night, she lit candles in every room, not for mourning, but for reclaiming. She wasn't here to haunt the past. She was here to name it. Over the weeks, Elise began restoring the house. She didn't hire decorators or designers. She sanded floors herself, scrubbed old tiles, called in former employees of the estate, who still remembered Celeste with affection. One woman, Nora, brought her a box of old letters Celeste had mailed from overseas. "She used to say you would come home one day," Nora said gently, handing the box over. "Not here, maybe, but home to yourself." Inside the letters, Elise found glimpses of the woman her mother had been. Fiercely intelligent, fluent in 5 languages, quietly radical in her softness. A woman who had loved Walter Harrington, but never needed his name to be whole. One letter stopped Elise cold. "If she finds this, tell her I didn't abandon her. I protected her. I left her with June because I knew the Harrington name would not let her live free. But I never stopped loving her. Never. Not for a second." Signed, C. Elise clutched it to her chest. This wasn't just restoration. It was resurrection. 3 months later, she launched the Moreau Foundation. Its mission, to fund education and housing for young women raised outside the margins, those denied legacy, denied names, denied safe beginnings. She started small, local grants, a scholarship in June's name, a community library near the docks. Reporters called her a philanthropist. The Harringtons tried to distance themselves, releasing bland statements of support laced with unease. But the people, the real ones, saw her. A woman not interested in power, but in purpose. A woman who had been erased and came back holding ink. She gave a speech during the library opening. Dressed simply, voice steady, I was raised in silence. In the corners of rooms where people forgot to say my name. But I learned that silence can be soil if you plant truth deep enough. I am not here because someone gave me permission. I am here because someone tried to erase a name and failed. The crowd stood. No applause, just stillness, the kind that holds reverence. Elise wasn't rich in the way magazines defined it, but she was full, and that terrified the family more than any lawsuit could. One afternoon, a letter arrived at the Vermont estate, handwritten, no return address. She opened it cautiously, heart beating fast. Inside, a single sentence. "He's dying. He asked for you." There was no signature, but she knew. She returned to the Harrington estate quietly. No photographers. No press. Walter lay in a private wing, breath shallow, machines humming in rhythm with time slipping away. The windows were open, the breeze soft. The man who once built empires looked small now. Human. Elise sat beside him. "You came," he rasped. "I didn't come for you," she said. "I came for me." He nodded faintly. "I wrote you into the public will," he said. "They're furious. I'm not here for what's written on paper." His eyes searched hers. "Do you hate me?" She paused. "No, but I carry what you didn't." Silence stretched. Then he whispered, barely audible. "Tell them. Tell the others. You are my daughter." She didn't cry. She simply said, "They'll know, whether I say it or not." After Walter's death, the estate was split. Courts tried to interfere, but the private will stood unchallenged. Elise donated her share of the mansion to a women's refuge. She kept the Vermont house and her mother's name. She never changed her last name to Harrington, because Elise Monroe had survived abandonment, invisibility, and truth buried in layers of power, and she had risen with her mother's voice in her blood. The funeral was not what they expected. The Harrington name demanded spectacle grand chapels, imported lily, politicians in dark suits making appearances they didn't mean. But Elise refused to let Walter be buried in a show of vanity. She insisted on something smaller, real. The chapel in Vermont held only 30 seats, no cameras, no speeches prepared by lawyers. Elise stood at the front, not in black, but in navy, the same dress she wore the night she arrived at the ballroom. She wore it deliberately, as memory, as reminder. The casket was closed. She began to speak, slowly, letting the silence stretch between each word. "I didn't know Walter Harrington as a father. I knew him as a silence that followed me into every room, into every mirror. I knew the absence of his voice, the weight of his decision not to choose. But I also know he was human, flawed, frightened, and in the end, he tried." A few murmurs from the back. Some members of the Harrington circle looked uncomfortable, but none dared interrupt her now. "He gave me the truth, even if too late. And that matters. Because truth has no deadline, it only has direction." She glanced at the casket, her voice softening. "You lived in fear of being undone by your choices. I lived by the consequences of them. Now we both rest. No applause, no music. Just the closing of the chapel doors and the sound of wind in the trees." Elise walked out first, her shadow long against the stone steps. Carter followed her after a long pause. He hadn't spoken to her since their confrontation. Now, standing beside her in the fading light, he said one thing. "You took nothing." She didn't answer. He tried again. "Not even the shares, not the family house. You gave it all away." She looked at him calmly. "Because it was never about having. It was about being." He blinked, confused. "I am who I am, Carter. Not because of what your father gave me, but because of what no one could take away." He didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. Elise returned to Vermont that same evening. She sat by the fireplace, reading her mother's letters out loud, one by one, as though Celeste might finally hear them. Each letter was a ribbon of grace and grit. Stories of protest marches in Paris, lectures in Senegal, moments of quiet defiance inside wealthy rooms. But there was one letter Elise had never noticed before. It was tucked inside an old copy of The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois, a thin, yellowed page, folded delicately, like a secret long preserved. My dearest Elise, if you ever read this, it means the truth found you. I hope you arrive not with rage, but with steadiness. You were born of love, but raised in courage. That matters more. Walter loved you. He was just afraid to live truthfully. I don't fault him, not anymore. Because I see now, if you found this, then you became what I dreamed. Whole, visible, free. Promise me this. Never trade your voice for a place at anyone's table. Build your own. Invite others. And if they ask who you are, tell them, I am the child they tried to erase, and I am still here. Love always. Mother Elise wept for the first time in months. Not out of grief, but out of arrival. Time moved forward. The Moreau Foundation grew. Elise never appeared in magazines, never accepted awards. But her work spoke louder than press releases. Her programs reached women in foster systems, shelters, and overlooked schools. Her mother's story was part of the curriculum in every program, a story of a woman denied her place, and a daughter who took it back without violence. Occasionally, letters arrived from people who once sneered at her, apologies in careful handwriting, donations accompanied by guilt. She accepted all with grace, but never let them near her peace. She kept the Vermont house simple. Books in every room, Celeste's easel untouched, the fireplace always ready. And once a year, on the night of the storm, the same night June found her wrapped in that white blanket, Elise lit a candle and whispered, I am the child you tried to erase, and I am still here. It was a cloudy morning when Elise received the letter that would close the last door. It came in an envelope aged by time, forwarded from a law office that had gone silent decades ago. No sender, no seal, just her name written in a careful, slanted hand that looked eerily familiar. Inside, a single sheet of paper, dated August 3rd, 1991. To my daughter, Elise Moreau Harrington. If you are reading this, it means you survived what I feared most, erasure. You may never fully understand what it meant for me to walk away, to choose obscurity over scandal, to let you grow without me in the public eye. I didn't abandon you. I buried you in safety. Because this family, the one whose name you now carry in pieces, is a house built on silence. And silence is a kind of wealth they spend freely. But you are the storm they didn't see coming. Use your name wisely. Not to echo their arrogance, but to carve space for those still invisible. With all that I never got to say, your mother, Celeste Elise, folded the letter carefully and set it beside the fireplace. She made tea slowly, in silence. The house was quiet, except for the soft ticking of the old clock Celeste had once owned. It reminded her that time, for all its cruelty, also leaves behind what it cannot carry away. Later that day, Elise walked into the attic. Dust swirled around her like memory. She uncovered the easel once more, the half-finished portrait of Celeste still looking out at her, and she began to paint. She didn't have formal training, just instinct, and something deeper, the need to complete what had been abandoned, to finish what had been interrupted. She worked for hours, days. She painted her mother's eyes brighter, gave her shoulders more strength, smoothed out the sorrow in her expression, and in the corner of the canvas, almost hidden in a wash of light, she painted herself, not front and center, just enough. Enough to say, I was here, I belong. On the first anniversary of Walter's death, Elise visited his grave, not for closure, not for forgiveness, but for truth. The headstone was polished, immaculate, surrounded by roses. She laid one white flower down and whispered, You were part of my story, but you were never the whole book. Then she walked away and didn't look back. In time, Elise became a name spoken with quiet reverence in rooms where no one once said her name at all. She never married, never sought headlines. Her joy came from watching others rise, young girls whose names no one knew, now speaking on stages with fire in their lungs. Women once discarded, now leading foundations, classrooms, councils. She kept her mother's violin in the Vermont house, though she never learned to play it. Some things, she decided, are meant to rest. But she played her own instrument, her voice, firm, gentle, irrefutable. One winter night, an interviewer, her first in years, asked her, "Do you regret never claiming your full inheritance? The fortune, the name, the board seat?" Elise smiled faintly. "I claimed something far more permanent," she said. "I claimed myself." The interviewer paused. "And who is that, exactly?" Elise leaned forward. Her voice was steady, soft. "I am the silence they tried to turn into absence. I am the memory they thought would fade. I am the truth they buried beneath paper and power, and I am still here." The final photo in the Vermont house was taken by a student from the foundation. A candid shot of Elise in the garden, barefoot, painting in the afternoon light, her face calm, unbothered by history, surrounded by wildflowers that weren't part of any design, just seeds she'd let fall. Underneath the frame, a brass plate bore no dates, no title, just a single line. She did not inherit the legacy. She rewrote it